All right, folks, now let's talk about criminal procedure. Now, any lawyer will tell you that this is one of the most boring classes that we had to suffer through in law school, so let's rephrase that a bit. Rather than teaching you criminal procedure, I'm going to try to unteach you some of the criminal procedure that we all think we understand from watching Law and Order bump on TV nonstop for the last 20 years, okay? The first common misconception that everybody who watches procedural television knows is that victims press charges because the police always ask, are you willing to press charges? And if the victim says no, the police officer has to walk away from apparently any crime. And if it's the other way around, if the person says yes, then the police officer has to arrest you whether a crime was really committed or not because I guess the victim says so. Well, that's Hollywood nonsense, folks. It's just nonsense. Governments press charges in the form of prosecutors. Victims do not press charges. It's amazing how many police officers don't know this. The 2 times that I was the victim of violent crime, both times the police officer asked me if I wanted to press charges. I was smart enough not to correct the officer. That's not something that a smart person does at the scene. I said, yes, sir, I am willing to press charges. What the officer really meant, even if the officer didn't know they really meant it, was if my boss's boss decides to press charges, can we count on your cooperation? Now that's a legitimate question because that might affect their ability to or not to prosecute. But trust me, folks, victims do not press charges. And if you still think I'm wrong, let me ask you a quick little question. If victims press charges, how do we prosecute murder cases? Okay, victims don't press charges. The next point I want to talk about with regard to criminal procedure is the all-important Fifth Amendment. Now, in my opinion, as a practicing criminal defense attorney, the Fifth Amendment maybe should be the first one. It's just so important. What's the Fifth Amendment essentially say? It says you have the right to remain silent, okay? Apparently, however, most of my clients don't have the ability to do that. I'm not sure why. Folks, if you can just shut up and make the state do its work, that's the biggest thing you can do to help yourself anytime there's a potential criminal prosecution coming down the pike. So I know we all have the right to remain silent. Please have the ability to remain silent. We'll come back to that. Next is the all-important Sixth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment says, amongst other things, you have the right to counsel. And you've all heard the Miranda warnings, hopefully only on TV, 100,000 times. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you and provided at no cost to you by the court. Is that true? A lot of people ask. The answer is yes and kind of no. It is true that if you can't afford an attorney, the court will provide one, provided the crime that you're accused of violating requires jail time. If it's a non-jailable offense, if it's a fine-only misdemeanor, interestingly, you do not have the right to counsel. But if it is a jailable offense, you do have the right to counsel, provided you can't afford it. Here's the problem there. Who decides whether they can afford it? Because guess what? It ain't you, it ain't me, it's the judge, okay? If you have a good job and a house and a vehicle and a job that, again, pays much more probably than the actual indigent level, most undoubtedly, folks, you're going to be deemed to be able to afford an attorney. So don't count on the court providing an attorney to you because it's not nearly as common as TV would have you believe. Moral of the story, if you get charged with violating a crime or committing a crime, violating a law in the state of Arizona, it is an expensive proposition to hire an attorney, especially gun crimes. The average retainer across the valley in Phoenix for a gun-related aggravated assault is probably somewhere around $30,000. If you have a job and a car and a house, it's very, very, very likely that you will not get a public defender. So how are you going to pay for your attorney now? That's a problem I'd like you to solve now, not then. There are lots of really great prepaid legal insurance schemes out there. The one I'm most partial to by far is the United States Concealed Carry Association. That's the one I think is the best, but shop around and make your own determination. They will provide the attorney of your choice at their expense. Normally you'd say, how can an insurance company possibly insure that? Because that's an intentional act. And as we're going to see in just a moment, there's no coverage for intentional acts. Well, someone very smarter than me, very much smarter than me, decided, well, we couldn't think of a better pool of risk takers than gun owners who are legally carrying concealed. That means they passed a background check, they've got some training. Guess what? The vast majority of us are never going to be involved in a shooting, and they know that. So they're happy to write those policies, and they really do work. I've had a number of clients who've hired me through those insurance policies, and they really do work like clockwork. There's no questions asked. As long as your fee's reasonable, it's paid. You get to choose your own attorney. If you use one of their attorneys, you can have a family attorney, a close friend. Maybe they don't practice criminal law, but you trust them. They can co-counsel. Most of these policies work really well. Think of a way for you to afford an attorney now before you need one, and hopefully you never will. But make sure you got that in place. Lastly is the concept of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. What the heck does that mean? I've given that jury instruction to juries probably 3 or 4 dozen times over my career, not to mention having, as an attorney, done it many more times than that. And the honest answer is, folks, is nobody really knows what it means. Beyond a reasonable doubt means it's beyond a reasonable doubt. What's the word reasonable mean? Well, it's in the eye of the beholder. Is that 95% sure? Is it 100% sure? Is it 48% sure? Well, we can sort of narrow in a bit because we know it's not 100% sure, because if it was 100% sure, that would be called beyond all doubt. So we know it's less than 100%. On the other end of the spectrum, we know it has to be greater than 51% sure, because by definition, 51% sure is what's called proof by preponderance of the evidence. That's the standard we see in civil cases, and you'll get a jury instruction that says it has to be above that. So we know it's somewhere between 52% sure and 99% sure. What number is the actual number? And the answer is there's an actual number. And the actual number is whatever the heck the jury wants it to be, okay? What is a jury? A jury is a jury of your peers. That's one definition. Another definition that I like is that it's 12 people who are too stupid to get out of jury duty. Also true. Here's another one. It is an animal that has a collective IQ of 1,200 and an average life experience of 600 years, okay? It's one of the dumbest people you've ever met, and it's one of the smartest people you've ever met, and there's no way to figure out what it's going to be. Lawyers have this thing we call voir dire, which is a French term. It means jury selection. Guess what? If I could select my juries, I would have retired at age 35 as a millionaire, okay? I don't select my jury. I deselect the other guy's jury. If you're a really appealing juror to me and you're somebody that I want on my jury, my opponent's going to strike you. If you're the kind of juror that I really, really don't like, my opponent's going to not strike you, of course, but I will. So if they like you, I strike them. If I like you, they strike them. Who's left on the jury pool? People that none of us like. That's the honest answer. Moral of the story, unlike a lot of attorneys who I think maybe encourage people to go to trial, I discourage people from going to trial, because once you step into that trial, it is completely beyond your control. It is totally up to 12 strangers. This is your life. This may be your life savings. It may be your home, your career, your marriage, your children, your family, everything, if it doesn't go well. And I would always say this: I don't care who your lawyer is. I don't care if it's F. Lee Bailey or Jesus Christ. If you step in front of a jury, there's a 20% chance you're going to prison. It is completely beyond your control. So the best option, in my opinion, is always try to figure out, is there any other acceptable option by way of a plea agreement if we couldn't get a dismissal to trial? And there usually is, so look into it. More on criminal procedure is the Fourth Amendment, okay? The Fourth Amendment is something that I think most of us know a little about, but I'm not sure how many of us know much about. There are three types of legal searches, also known as a search and seizure, under the Fourth Amendment. The first is what's called a probable cause search. A probable cause search oftentimes will end up with the state getting a warrant, in which case they're going to search you with that warrant. They don't have to have a warrant if they have probable cause that a felony has been committed. So understand that. The second one is called an exigent circumstance search, aka an emergency. I'm walking past an apartment complex with my partner on my beat, and we see black smoke billowing out of a window on the second floor of an apartment complex. Clearly a fire. Can we run up the stairs, kick that door down to make sure everyone's safe? And when the smoke clears and we find out we just kicked in the door of a meth lab, can we legally arrest the people that were running that meth lab? The answer is yes, because that's a legal search pursuant to an emergency, okay? But by far the most common legal search is the one that's the least understood, and that's the one that's known as a consensual search. A police officer stops you for speeding. They come up and they say, "Excuse me, sir, do you have any explosives or drugs in the vehicle I should know about this evening?" And you, as somebody watching this video, is of course going to say no, because you're not. And the officer may then say something like this: "Well, sir, I hate to inconvenience you, and I know it's a small inconvenience, but I promised my wife I would do this at every traffic stop for my own safety so I can get home to see my kids tonight. Would you mind terribly stepping out of the vehicle and letting me just for a moment do a quick cursory check of your vehicle to verify that, just so we're both safe?" And do you know that 90% of Americans consent to that? And I would say that probably 90% of that 90% really don't understand that they have the right not to consent. You have the right not to consent, folks, okay? It's called the Fourth Amendment. So why would you not consent to that? Well, it's in the Bill of Rights. And I don't know about you, but the Bill of Rights is very important to me. If we don't use those rights, we're going to lose those rights. So to me, just as a patriot, I think that's something you need to take into consideration. I would say something politely to the officer like this: "Officer, with all due respect, sir, or ma'am, if you're telling me you're going to search my car, I will of course step aside and allow you to do so, because I don't want anyone to get hurt tonight. On the other hand, if you're asking my permission to search my car, the answer is unequivocally, with all due respect to you and what you do, no. Because as much as I believe in you, I believe in the Bill of Rights even more, and I'm not going to waive my rights to the Fourth Amendment. So with all due respect, the answer is no under those terms, okay? I have clients who will then say, "Well, that's great, but how do I know if they're asking or if they're telling?" And that also is a very simple answer. If they're asking you, you're having this conversation. If they're telling you, your face is on the ground, there's a boot on the back of your head, and there's two cops searching your car. It's very easy to determine the difference, okay? Even if you don't think the Bill of Rights is that big a deal, there's one other reason you might want to refuse consent, and that is, are you absolutely certain that there's nothing in your car that could get you in trouble? I know that I don't drink. I don't have booze in my car. I've never smoked marijuana. I know there's no drugs in my car. But you know that little bastard that's dating my daughter that borrowed my truck a couple of weekends to go for that canoe trip? How do I know a reefer? I know that's not the current hip term. A joint didn't fall out of his pocket and it's not underneath my back seat right now. How do I know that for a fact? How do I know that that guy that vacuumed out my car at the car wash last week didn't have a dime bag of meth fall out of his pocket and it's underneath my rear seat right now? I'm not really comfortable with letting somebody search my car. So that's my opinion. I want you to know the law, and the law is you have the right to refuse that. So understand you at least know what your rights are. Okay? And that's the Fourth Amendment, and that's pretty much criminal procedure. Now, let's talk about civil procedure, which was an even more boring class than criminal procedure. And the fact of the matter is, folks, in Arizona, most of the time these issues aren't going to come up. I could spend another hour talking about civil law issues for you, but the simple fact is most of them don't really come up in practice because of something called the intentional act exclusion that exists in just about every insurance policy that you're ever going to read. What that means is there's no insurance coverage if what you did was done intentionally, okay? If you murder somebody, there's no insurance coverage, okay? John Wayne Gacy's insurance company did not pay out 33 claims for people that were buried in his crawl space. There's no coverage because murder is an intentional act. But here's where it gets interesting. Guess what else is an intentional act? Self-defense. If you shoot somebody that breaks into your house and you get sued for that and what you did was on purpose, clearly, there's no insurance coverage. Your homeowners will just wave at you and say, sorry, Charlie. There's no homeowners coverage. There's also no auto coverage if it happens in relation to your vehicle because, again, it's an intentional act. This sets up a bit of a catch-22. If you claim that you shot them non-intentionally, now you might have insurance coverage. You also just pled guilty to a serious crime. I guess I'd much rather be bankrupt and not in prison than in prison with some money in a bank somewhere. And if you want a role model on that, I guess let's talk about O.J. Simpson. Very, very wealthy guy who was sued, was ordered to pay $78 million in damages over 25 years ago, and to date has not paid a single penny, by my way of understanding, to the plaintiffs in that case, even though he was a fantastically wealthy millionaire when the verdict came down. Suits against persons who get involved in shootings in the state of Arizona are very, very rare, and the main reason for that, as I've already hinted at, is that there's just no money in it. If there's no insurance coverage, even if you sue a wealthy person, and even if you're successful, what's going to happen? They're going to file for bankruptcy, divest themselves of their assets, move to a bankruptcy creditor-friendly state, or rather debtor-friendly state, such as Florida, like OJ did, and you're going to find that you simply can't get money out of them. So plaintiffs' attorneys aren't normally interested in spending 2,000 or 3,000 hours over the next 2 or 3 years and $100 grand out of their pocket to impress the jury with all their audio-visual tricks for the trial, knowing that there's a slim to none chance they'll ever get any money back out of the case. Why did the OJ case actually go to trial? Because the attorney there knew how infamous that case was, knew he was going to be broadcasting the case on CNN 11 hours a day for 9 weeks, and would become a household name after that. So even the O.J. Simpson case can teach us a lot about that, the whole concept of civil damages. Why am I telling you not to worry too much about it? Because guess what? At the moment of truth, if God forbid you ever need to draw your gun and defend yourself or defend your family, you're going to have enough other stuff bouncing around in your head already without cluttering it up with fear of a bankruptcy, okay? So pretty much don't worry about that. We have laws in Arizona that make that very difficult. For instance, ARS 13413 basically says that you can't be sued if you did something legally in self-defense. So we have statutes in our state that a lot of states don't that make that even more unlikely. So try not to worry too much about civil liability with regard to carrying your gun. Now I'd like to talk about something that I think is really important. It's actually very easy to remember and fairly easy to teach, and maybe the most or second most important thing we're going to cover today. And it's what I call the 3 C's of carrying a gun, okay? These 3 will act in concert to reduce your possible liability criminally or civilly, okay? And in order of what I think is important, they are concealment, common sense, and courtesy. The 3 C's. If you can follow those 3 rules, you're never going to need a gun, and you're certainly never going to need a gun lawyer, okay? Let's break them down just a bit more. Let's talk about concealment. Concealment is defined most commonly when you ask somebody, hey, is your gun concealed? And they say, yes. Why is it concealed? And they'll say, because it's not visible. Well, that's not nearly enough, folks. The definition needs to be, no one knows you have a gun, okay? If the way you move tells me you have a gun, if the way you cinch up your pants, pull the right side of your pants up only, if you make a clunky noise when you walk through a door frame and your hip hits, and I hear a metallic instead of a bone-sounding hit when it hits the door frame, when you reach for groceries, when you're in Starbucks and you reach like this to grab your wallet and you sweep your shirt back and you show somebody you have a gun, these are all ways that you'll inadvertently let people know you're carrying guns. You can't do that. You've got to practice this. Before you get your permit, I would recommend that you take your unloaded gun, conceal it, and walk around your house for a couple of weeks. Let your spouse or your kids or somebody point out whether they can spot you have a gun. I used to have a standing bet with my friends whether I was carrying a gun or not. And I won that bet many times. They'd say, no, you're not carrying a gun, and I certainly was. Make sure you're concealing it to where nobody knows you're concealing it. It really is beautiful kindergarten level logic. If no one knows you have a gun, it is impossible to get in trouble because you have a gun. Concealment, folks, it really, really is the big thing. Don't let these tells and the fact that the gun's wearing you alert other people to the fact that you have a gun. Make sure that you carry the gun in such a way that no one knows you have a gun at any point in time. Now let's talk about common sense. In the immortal words of one of my favorite instructors, John Farnham, don't do stupid things or hang around with stupid people or go to stupid places. If you can follow that advice, I doubt you're ever going to need a gun, let alone a lawyer to help you because of that gun, okay? Think for a second. Use common sense. Basically, if you're going to do this, understand that it better be something you do if your mom was watching, okay? The legal version of a mom is called a prosecutor/judge/jury. If you don't want other people to know that you did it, then don't do it, okay? Make sure you understand that concept. I know it's not very manly to say this, but really it's almost always possible to simply back away from the situation, okay? It kind of gets back to the next one, which is courtesy, okay? What do I mean by courtesy? Well, there's a lot of jokes out there about this, but what it really boils down to is this, okay? You need to be polite to people. You can't get into arguments because arguments lead to fights, and fights lead to armed confrontation. Armed confrontation leads to jail term and caskets, okay? Simply walk away. Some jerk whips right in front of me and takes my parking space at the mall, okay? What I want to do is put my truck in four-wheel low and drive right over the top of, you know, it's a Toyota Prius. That's what I want to do. What am I going to do? I'm going to breathe deeply, count to 3, say a brief prayer that person gets really, really bad hemorrhoids, and then find another parking space, okay? It's not worth engaging. If I get out and flip them off or curse, and they get out and flip me off back and curse, they push me, I push them, they draw a knife, I have to shoot them, way to go. Maybe you'll be acquitted of the murder charge after you've bankrupted your entire family and spent a year in jail, non-bondable, and you're going to call that a victory? That is not a victory. Walk away from the confrontation, okay? And by the way, if I could just find a quote where John Wayne said, just walk away in one of his movies, this would be so much easier to teach. I know that hurts all of us, but I'm telling you, it's the truth. Now, let's talk about some crimes that you could specifically be charged with in the state of Arizona by virtue of the fact that you've decided to carry a gun and live an armed lifestyle. The one that everybody always asks about first, of course, is murder, because, gosh, it's sexy. If it bleeds, it leads. Let's go ahead and talk about murder. Well, statistically, folks, it's very, very unlikely anybody watching this is ever going to be involved in a murder, because you know why? We're law-abiding people. We're not sociopaths, okay? I think I mentioned this earlier. I've carried a gun almost every single day for 26 years. I've never once drawn my gun, let alone fired my gun. What we're going to find is that in the United States of America, guns are used to stop crimes approximately 2.5 million times per year. And you know what? Statistics show that only 10% of those times is the gun actually discharged. The mere presentation of the gun is 90% of the time enough to stop the progress of the situation. So 90% of the time you don't even have to fire your gun. We'll come back to some other statistics on that in just a minute, but it's very unlikely you'll actually need to shoot your gun. As a consequence, it's very unlikely, unless you're a drug dealer out there doing mean, evil things, that you're ever going to kill somebody with your firearm. That said, just to satisfy the people who want to find, if it bleeds, it leads, let's go ahead and talk about homicide. In Arizona, we have 3 different types of homicide, 3 different levels, if you will. The least serious is known as negligent homicide. That's ARS 13-1102. Negligent homicide is when you negligently kill somebody. That could be as innocuous as you're driving down the road, you take your eyes off the road to adjust your radio, you look back up the road, too late to avoid the child that just chased a ball out into the street, and you hit him and you kill him. Were you negligent? Arguably you were. Did you kill somebody? You did. You're looking at a potential prison sentence of somewhere around 5 years for the crime of negligent homicide. One step up the ladder of culpability is something called manslaughter. Manslaughter is recklessly causing the death of another. What is the difference between recklessness and negligence? About 2 years of law school and many sleepless nights. Let's see if we can sum it up pretty quickly here, however. What is recklessness? Recklessness is really, really, really negligent negligence. What do you think of that definition, lawyers? I think that works pretty well. Here's an example of manslaughter. You're driving the same car down the same street, the same kid's chasing the same ball out into that street, but instead of taking your eyes off the road for a few seconds to adjust the radio, you set your cruise control, unsnap your seatbelt, and climb over 2 seats to get into the very back of your station wagon to get a nice cold beer out of the cooler back there, and your unpiloted car kills the same kid. Well, it wasn't necessarily intentional. You didn't mean it to happen, but oh my God, how could anybody be that stupid? You dummy. You knew that was going to hurt somebody. That's known as recklessness. Reckless homicide is better known in Arizona as manslaughter. Now you're looking at 10 to 15 years in prison for manslaughter. And then lastly, the highest form of homicide in the state of Arizona, of course, is known as murder. Murder comes in two separate degrees, as you all know from watching TV, first-degree murder and second-degree murder. Second-degree murder is 13-1104. Second-degree murder is when you intentionally cause death, but it was not premeditated. So I walk in on my wife and my best friend, as Bogey used to say, in flagrant delicto, and I snap and I grab the gun off of the nightstand that should have been in a safe in the first place, if you've watched our other videos. And I, without even thought, I pick up that gun in a feat of passion, in a fit of jealousy, and I blow my wife's head off, okay? I did it on purpose, but it wasn't premeditated. It wasn't something I planned. That's second-degree murder. That's 20 years to life with the possibility of parole. What if I walk in and I catch them in bed and I snap, but I do it quietly, and I walk back quietly and I close the door and I go, wow, that makes me madder than I assumed that it would. And I decide to go out to my garage, get into my shop, open up my gun safe, get a shotgun, load it, walk back in the house, kick the door open, and decapitate both of them in my bed. They only lived a minute or so longer, but the difference is it was premeditated. I put a plan into action, I put thought into the plan, I carried the plan out. That is now first-degree murder. First-degree murder is life without parole, or even the death penalty if it's a capital crime. There's one other type of first-degree murder in Arizona and several other states, and that is known as felony murder. If you commit a serious felony and a human death results from that, you're guilty of first-degree murder. Let's say I decide to rob a liquor store to finance my meth habit, but I don't want to hurt anybody, I just need money for meth, so my gun is actually not even loaded. And I go into the liquor store and I put it in the guy's face and I say, stick 'em up, mister, give me all the money in the cash register. And he goes, okay, calm down, calm down. And he reaches into the cash register for what I assume is going to be a handful of $20 bills, and instead he comes out with a handful of Smith & Wesson J-frame and shoots me. The bullet doesn't kill me. It passes through my shoulder and hits a little old lady standing behind me over in the Kahlua aisle, right in the eyeball, and kills her instantly. Guess what? I'm guilty of first-degree murder because I committed a serious criminal act, armed robbery, and that criminal act indirectly, although relatedly, caused a human death. And that's enough for me to go away for the rest of my life for first-degree murder. That's called, again, the felony murder rule. Now let's talk about some statutes that might actually come into play. I told you that murder is not really going to happen here, and it's not. Let's talk about some things you might actually need to worry about. Endangerment, which is ARS 13-1201. What is endangerment? Doing something stupid with a gun. If I was sitting here with a loaded firearm and a beer and I was drinking and I showed you my gun was loaded and I was pulling a Roy Rogers and spinning it around on my hand, I'll bet you could hear all the cameramen in here running and you could hear door slamming. Why? Because that's very, very dangerous. That's stupid and it endangers people's lives. That violates 13-1201, endangerment, a class 6 dangerous felony, okay? Don't do stupid stuff with guns. Next up would be threatening and intimidating, ARS 13-1202. Basically, folks, in downstate Illinois where I was born, we were taught to be polite, and you didn't go around threatening and intimidating people. As I got older, I met people from north of I-80, aka Chicago in Illinois, and I think they were all taught to threaten and intimidate people and be rude from a young age because that's how they seem to act. Okay, no big deal. Until I moved to Arizona and studied for the Arizona bar, I'd never heard of a crime called threatening and intimidating. It's actually a class 1 misdemeanor. Now, class 1 misdemeanors, or any misdemeanor for that matter, don't ruin your life. This particular misdemeanor, however, if that's coupled with the fact that you're also carrying a gun, if you're carrying a firearm and you're going around threatening people or intimidating people, guess what? That could very easily blossom into our next statute, which is, in fact, a very big deal. Let's talk about assault. Now, assault in Arizona is a misdemeanor, okay? It is actually 3 different types of conduct result in a misdemeanor conviction. What's called an A1, A2, and A3 assault. These are all subsets of ARS 13-1203. They're all misdemeanors, okay? Misdemeanor assault comes in one of 3 flavors. I intentionally assault somebody physically. So, your typical 2 drunks in a bar get into an argument over a girl. I hit you in the eye, your eye swells shut, I split your lip open. I'm going to get charged with a class 1 misdemeanor for assault, okay? The second type of assault, and we'll come back to how important this is in a moment, is you don't actually have to carry through the assault. If I simply place you in fear of getting hit, that's enough for me to be convicted of assault. So if I act like I'm going to hit you, but I stop. Remember that guy in 7th grade? That's how he started fights. Guess what? That is actually a crime called assault. If I swing at you, but I miss you, it's assault. You don't have to connect. In other words, we're going to see the analogy on aggravated assault on that in just a moment. And the third type of assault is if you knowingly touch somebody with the intent to injure, insult, or provoke them. So if I poke you in the chest trying to get you to swing first, or if I do this, and spit a big goober in your face. We all remember that guy from 7th grade as well, right? That is also, that mere act itself is also assault. in the state of Arizona. Okay, so those are the three types of assault. Now let's talk about, I guess, the fourth type of assault, which is the one that, if you're like me, will cost you sleep. Okay, and that is aggravated assault. This is ARS 13-1204. Aggravated assault is a felony, and it is a very serious, life-altering crime, and it's by far and away the most serious crime that I handle with regard to firearms as a gun lawyer. Okay, what is aggravated assault? Well, it starts off as simply an assault. So any of those three types of assault we just discussed, coupled with any one or more of these spicy additives, okay? Number one, the person that you assault is seriously injured, okay? Well, who determines what injury is serious? Guess what the answer is, folks? The prosecutor / judge / jury. Breaking a bone, putting somebody in the hospital, requiring surgery. If you hit somebody in the face and unbeknownst to you, they have some sort of blood disorder, causes massive swelling that puts pressure on the retina and blinds them. Guess what? Blinding somebody, serious injury, you're going to prison for a long time. We'll talk about the consequences in just a moment. So the first category of ag assault is you seriously injure somebody. The second one, which concerns most of us, is that the manner in which you commit the assault involves your use or threatened use of a deadly weapon. What is a deadly weapon? Well, clearly a firearm is always a deadly weapon. What else is a deadly weapon? This isn't a real gun, as we've already covered. This is a red gun, okay? But it's solid, pretty stiff plastic. What if you're on the ground and I'm pounding you on the side of the temple with this? Is it a deadly weapon now, even though it's a fake gun? Sure it is. How about a ballpoint pen? If I'm stabbing you in the eye with a ballpoint pen, it's a deadly weapon. So in other words, almost anything can be a deadly weapon and will be used that way for prosecution here. But guess what, guys? If you're carrying a gun, you always are in possession of a deadly weapon, no matter what, okay? So if you assault somebody or place them in fear of being assaulted with a deadly weapon, that makes it ag assault. Another one is if you assault somebody while they are restrained. So if somebody is in a wheelchair and you assault them, or if you're having kinky sex and they're restrained and you assault them, you better know who your partner is. You might want to get one of those liability waivers that us lawyers worry about now before your sex partner consents to something like that, because anytime somebody's restrained and you assault them, a mere slap, that can qualify as ag assault, believe it or not. Lastly, if you assault a member of a protected class of citizenry, okay? Most commonly, police officers. If you assault me today, dressed as I am, doing what I'm doing today, if you spit on me, let's say, that's a simple Class 1 misdemeanor assault. If you spit on me when I'm wearing my MCSO captain's uniform, that is now an aggravated assault, because the person you just committed that simple assault upon is a police officer. Several categories of people: police officers, healthcare providers, minors under the age of 15, senior citizens over the age of 75, prosecutors, teachers. There's a litany of different categories of people. If you assault one of these folks, it magically, legally becomes an aggravated assault. Aggravated assault, the presumptive prison term in the state of Arizona is 7.5 years. By the way, again, I keep saying presumptive prison terms. Arizona has mandatory sentencing guidelines. You're on a sentencing matrix. It's going to be mitigated, presumptive, or aggravated. 80% of the people convicted of ag assault in Arizona will be sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. It's a life-altering consequence. Please, folks, think before you act. Criminal trespass, we already covered, ARS 13-1502. Again, if you're going into a place, a mall, something like that, and it's posted no firearms, understand how that actually works and make your own decision, okay? I'm never going to tell you to break the law. I'm an officer of the court, but I want you to understand the consequences if you do break the law. In this particular setting, the consequence will be you'll be asked to leave. To me, I'd rather be there to protect my family and maybe even your family in a mall rather than be another one of the sheep who's unarmed if I go someplace that's very likely to endure a mass shooting like that. So take that for what it's worth, make your own decision. And then lastly, we have another statute that you need to be aware of known as disorderly conduct. That's ARS 13-2904. Disorderly conduct is a bifurcated statute in that if you break it one way, it's a misdemeanor. If you break it another way, it's a felony. If you're playing an accordion in your backyard at 3 a.m., it's a Class 1 misdemeanor. If you're playing your Uzi in your backyard at 3 a.m. to celebrate New Year's, it's a Class 6 felony. Kind of gets back once again, don't do stupid stuff with guns.